Hello, everyone. Welcome back to class. We're transitioning into a new unit for the next 2 weeks. And in this unit, we're going to be looking at Buddhism, which is another Eastern philosophy or religion to come out of Southeast Asia. And it's one that has had a profound effect on Eastern history and Western history up until this point a little bit, and one that I think is very interesting and worth studying. So today what I'm going to do, which is going to be the general outline for all of the philosophies of life that we look at in this class, is I'm going to first touch on the history, basic teachings of the view, and then talk about the text that we're going to explore. And then next week, we're actually going to look at some of the passages in a primary text so that you can get some experience reading some actual Buddhist doctrine that has been around for thousands of years. But today, what I'm going to do is just give you kind of an overview of this view, what it says, what its history is, and how it's related to Asian perspectives in general and philosophy more specifically. So let's go ahead and get started. First, I'm going to start by talking about the history of Buddhism. Buddhism is an ancient Eastern philosophy, you might even say a religion, which originated in Southeast Asia based on the teachings of a guy known as Siddhartha Gautama, literally the Buddha, which means the enlightened or the awakened one, who was born in 6th century BCE. So Buddhism is basically the tradition, the way of life, the philosophy that was developed by this guy and his followers. Uh, and it's a religion that is practiced widely in Asia and has come to form a really influential part of Eastern philosophy, Eastern culture, Eastern history. As it stands right now, I believe it has over 500 million followers, and it spans over 2,500 years of history and development. One thing that I'd like to kind of hammer on in today's lecture is that Buddhism is a very diverse philosophy. Earlier, I called it a philosophy or a religion. Depending on the person that you're talking to, Buddhism may be just a way of life, it might be a lifestyle, or it might be a ritualistic religion in which the person is really engaged in particular religious ritual, have a particular religious conception of the divine, and so on and so forth. But it really is a diverse tradition, a diverse view. For some, it'll be a philosophy. For some, it'll be a lifestyle. For some, it will be a religion. We can kind of quibble over these terms. The main idea that I want to get across in this slide is that it is very diverse and it has informed not only the cultures in which it has sprung up, but it has changed and morphed with the cultures and the societies in which it has merged. So it's been informed by the cultures around it, and it has come to inform, in large part, Asian society, especially Japanese society, Chinese society, so on and so forth. And there really are a lot of different strains of Buddhism that focus on different aspects of it, different traditions, different rituals, and teachings. For example, we have Theravada Buddhism that's practiced primarily in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. We have Mahayana Buddhism in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Those are the areas in which this version of Buddhism is primarily practiced. And then we have Tibetan Buddhism, which is practiced obviously in Tibet, Nepal, and India. You may have heard of Tibetan Buddhism if you've ever seen or heard of the Dalai Lama. He is one of the primary kind of avatars of Tibetan Buddhism. And so Buddhism has a lot of different flavors. It has informed and continues to inform a lot of different societies. A lot of the things that we'll be reading about or investigating is going to be interpreted differently depending on the Buddhist strain that you're looking at. So what I aim to do today is give you kind of a general overview of Buddhist philosophy that the majority, if not all of the different Buddhist philosophies believe in and espouse. but the different ideas we'll be looking at will be more or less applicable depending on the Buddhist strain that you're looking at. Okay, well, let's get started now that history is out of the way. Related to Buddhist texts, there are several different Buddhist texts that exist. For example, one of them is known as the Pali Canon. Because Buddhism found its way into a lot of different countries in Southeast Asia, a lot of different cultures, its texts that people rely on sprung up in a lot of different places. So there's no one particular canon that all Buddhists follow. Some Buddhists might follow one canon, other Buddhists might follow other canons that emphasize different aspects of the Buddhist and his followers' teachings. What we need to understand about Buddhism is that because it's so diverse and because several different texts exist, we should interpret these texts as offering us a general path, a general view of the world that is meant to meet us where we are on our own particular spiritual journeys. Not everybody is going to be at the same point on their spiritual journeys, and on account of that, if we are looking at Buddhist texts, we might not interpret the passages as meaning the same thing because we're different, we have different views of the world, we're at different phases on our spiritual journey. So we should interpret the text that we're going to be looking at in this class, the Dhammapada, as offering us kind of a general view or outline of what Buddhism says, what the nature of human existence is like, and therefore how we ought to act in our lives. It's not going to be extremely specific, it's going to be more general, overarching umbrella themes. So generally the path that an individual is going to follow if they're practicing Buddhism is they're going to build up merit in their lives by doing good deeds. Eventually they might kind of forsake society somewhat and forsake their relationships and social and economic obligations by entering into monkhood so that they can better understand Buddhism and follow it. Progressing along the path, they'll try to become more wise and really interrogate and try to understand the Buddhist texts. Eventually, the result of all this is that hopefully the individual has come to a point where they can liberate themselves from, as we will see, the cyclical nature of the universe, the sufferable nature of the universe, to achieve nirvana or nibbana, which literally means an expelling out or a breathing out, escaping the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. So, when we look at the Dhammapada in this class, try to view it more in general terms, but then also see how you can apply it to your own specific situation. We're all going to be coming up with kind of different interpretations exactly of what the text says. They're not meant to give us extremely specific guidelines because, again, we're all different. We all have different views. We're all at different phases on our spiritual journey. Now, what exactly does Buddhism say? Well, in order to understand that, we need to look at the story of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha himself. Siddhartha was a son to a noble and strong and wealthy person. He ended up living a pretty lavish life within the palace. He had all of the comforts and the food and the pleasures that anybody living in a very wealthy situation can ask for. And he lived a pretty sheltered existence until he ended up becoming a teenager. It was then that he was permitted by his father, who wanted to protect him from the world, to actually leave the palace and see the world a little bit. And on this initial journey, he ended up seeing, according to legend, three things: a diseased person, somebody who is suffering from sickness, an old man, and a corpse. And it was on this journey and seeing these different things that Siddhartha realized that human life was full of suffering, that he had been shielded from these different aspects of human life up until this point. And this really kind of sent Siddhartha into something like an existential crisis. Upon returning back to the palace, he didn't feel like his life was really filled with fulfillment. He didn't feel like his life was all that exciting or wonderful anymore. The suffering of human life really bore down on him, and he started to question, well, why is it that I don't have to suffer like these people? Is suffering inevitable? Am I going to end up going through this stuff too? And after a few more years of living under his father's rule, being sheltered from these things, he ended up leaving the palace once again. And he tried to figure out a way of trying to escape the inevitable suffering that he saw coming down the line. He knew that he might get sick one day, that he might not fulfill all of his dreams and his goals, that he would get old and eventually die. And so he started thinking, well, how can I escape this? How can I overcome the suffering of human life? And so for a while, 6 years, according to legend, he lived with a group of ascetic monks who tried to transcend their own suffering by depriving themselves of pleasure, by depriving themselves of food and drink and sex and the carnal pleasures of mortal life. And after a while, uh, Siddhartha found that this life was not fulfilling. Similar to the life in the palace that had all this pleasure and luxury, that he didn't have to worry about anything. This ascetic life, this life of deprivation, did not cause him to escape the suffering. He still found it was unfulfilling ultimately. And so he meditated on that fact. He thought long and hard about how to escape the suffering of human life. And it is said that under a particular tree, he achieved enlightenment. He became awakened to the nature of human existence, the cause of suffering, and how humans can escape the suffering of human life. From then on, he would go around and he would bring disciples into his fold, and he would tell people how they can escape suffering, how they can make their life better. This is the origins of Buddhism. These sayings were then written down by his followers and put into different Buddhist texts, which have then been practiced by people for the last 2,500 years. And so, one of the things that we're going to see in Buddhism is that it encourages us to reconceptualize human life, our relationship to human suffering, and it's going to encourage us to kind of detach ourselves from human life. This is fundamentally different from how life is encouraged to be lived in Western society and in Western philosophy. Generally, philosophers in the United States and in Europe are going to say things like, you can cultivate a fulfilled, happy life if you just attach yourself to the proper things. So if you attach yourself to your family and you show up for your familial relationships, you'll be happy. Or if you attach yourself to a particular religion or God, you'll be able to find purpose in your life and meaning, and you'll be fulfilled. Or if you attach yourself to a particular project or life goal, that will allow you to be fulfilled and find meaning. Eastern philosophies in general are going to say, no, that's not really how it works. Actually, what we should be doing is we should be not caring so much about all these different things, not investing so much energy and effort into all of these aspects of human life, but detach ourselves from them, learn to accept what is and what comes down the pipe, and to not make so much of a fuss over it, not try to control everything as we are wont to do in Western society. And so the Buddha is going to encourage us to reconceptualize suffering, the origins of suffering in our life, and if we want to escape suffering, to not invest ourselves so much in all of this crap, in materiality and possessions and dreams and goals, to learn to accept and take life as it is. We'll see this in Taoism as well. And so, in his book, An Introduction to Buddhist Philosophy, Stephen Lamachus urges us to see the Buddha as a doctor, someone who is recognizing that people have a sickness, metaphorical sickness, who attempts to diagnose them and then who tries to lead them to health by giving them a certain treatment plan. I would urge you to see Buddhism as something similar as well, trying to diagnose what our sickness is and then lead us to health if we are willing to put ourselves uh, within the Buddha's treatment plan. One of the central ideas of Buddhism is this idea that each individual is not only fully responsible for their actions, but their actions end up kind of producing the kind of life that they end up having. This is not a very deep idea, right? The idea is, look, how you think, speak, and act in your life is going to produce certain consequences. Those consequences, whether they are good or bad for you, are going to depend on the kinds of things that you think, speak, and do. What's more than this, though, is that Buddhism is going to say, look, if you want to have a good life, it's up to you to think and speak and act in good ways. Okay? We can't avoid acting in human life. We have to act, right? We have to get up and walk around and cook and say things and do things and work our jobs. We got to do this stuff. We can't avoid doing this stuff if we're going to continue to survive. But what we do and how we do those things, those are the things that are going to impact our life in the long run, and ultimately whether or not we achieve liberation from suffering. In this way, Buddhism is kind of an individualistic philosophy in some sense. It's going to say that it's up to each one of us to walk our own spiritual path towards liberation from suffering. Nobody can do it for us. Thus, the author of the introduction that I'm going to ask you to read for this week says, quote, "Man is the maker and master of himself, the protector or destroyer of himself, the savior of himself." And so, according to Buddhism, how our lives end up is ultimately up to us in some fundamental sense. We can't place the blame on everything outside of us. Okay, we can't say, oh, it's his fault that my life is messed up. Oh, it's society's fault that I'm not happy. Oh, it's this, that, and the other thing that I'm not able to be successful and live a flourishing life. No. At the end of the day, Buddhism is going to insist upon, yes, there are things outside of your control, but that does not cause you, that does not determine that your life is going to suck. At the end of the day, much of our suffering, the Buddhists are going to say, is up to our own outlook, our own attitudes, our own moods, our own actions, things that we actually have control over. And so, contrary to Western religion, Christianity in particular, which says you need to be saved by a God that comes in from the outside and helps you, Buddhism is going to say, no, you actually have to save yourself. And the only way to do that is ultimately by quashing your desires, by liberating yourself from desire. Because as we will see, desire is what gives rise to action, which causes us to perpetuate this cycle of reincarnation that we are stuck in. And so Buddhism is going to strongly insist that if we want to live a happy and flourishing life, if we want to escape suffering, if we want to liberate ourselves from this cycle of reincarnation, what we need to do is we need to change our minds. We need to change our outlooks, our attitudes, and our actions out there in the world. In large part, it is our minds, it's how we see the world, how we interpret the world, that determines our destiny. Not a divine plan, fate that we're stuck in, not a social structure, not your race, not your economic status, not whether or not you're a celebrity or famous. No, so much of our suffering, according to Buddhism, comes or falls out of how our mind is oriented with respect to the world. Not physical stuff, not material stuff, not social or economic stuff. And we actually have a lot of control over how our mind works, the kinds of thoughts that we have. Not necessarily like being able to flip a switch on enough, but we can, through a process, reconfigure how it is that we think and see the world, which is going to lead us to have certain thoughts, speech, and actions, which is going to impact ourselves and others down the line. Now I'd like to get into what's called Buddhist metaphysics. In philosophy, metaphysics is the field associated with investigating what the universe is like. What makes up stuff in the universe? What makes up this water bottle? What is the relationship between this water bottle and my body? Is there a difference between the mind and the body? Are they made up of different substances? What are time and space? How do they work? All of these things fall within the domain of metaphysics. And Buddhism has a particular metaphysical view of the universe, namely, that we're caught in this cycle of reincarnation known as samsara that is driven by karma, action. Samsara is meant to denote in Buddhist philosophy the endless cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth that the universe operates according to. Okay? All humans are stuck within this cycle. Arguably, all living things are stuck within this cycle. And what we do during our lives is going to end up influencing the nature of our rebirth and where we are reborn. There are more realms than just this physical earthly realm in existence. There are more heavenly realms and there are more hellish realms. And what we get reborn as and how that life ends up for us, whether or not we go down the cosmic ladder or up the cosmic ladder, is a result of our actions or karma. You should think of karma as consequences or fruits that fall out of how we think, what we say, and what we do throughout our lives. Think of performing an action as planting a seed. When you lie to your significant other, or when you help the old lady across the street, any action you perform, you're planting a certain seed that eventually is going to blossom into something down the line. Whether that seed grows into a good fruit that is good for you and others, or a bad fruit, a bad flower, is going to depend on the nature of the action that you take. So this cycle that we are all stuck in, that the universe operates according to, this samsara, is driven by karma. Karma, what falls out of our actions, is spurned on by desire. The reason that we act is that we have desires for things, right? I pick up this water bottle because I'm thirsty and I want a drink of water. I pick up this phone because I have a desire to give you some kind of example so that you can understand Buddhism better. Basically, think of every action that you perform as planting a seed which is going to blossom into something later. Some people interpret karma as meaning something like if you do good things are going to happen to you. Most people interpret it in a more in a looser way. It's not necessarily that doing good things, like if you give $5 to someone, then somebody's going to give $5 to you down the line. It's more like doing the good thing is going to shape you and mold you into a better person, which is going to impact your outlook and how people treat you and what life is like for you. It's going to make life better, but it might not be a one-to-one concrete thing like the $5 thing I just said. So, we're stuck in this cycle. The cycle is driven by karma. The Buddhists also have an idea, and don't mind me butchering the pronunciation here, known as Pratitya Samutpada. Sanskrit is not my first language, so just bear with me throughout the course of these lectures as I kind of butcher some of these Chinese and Sanskrit words. This idea stipulates that all things, events, objects, happenings in the world are causally conditioned by and dependent on other processes, events, or happenings. In other words, Nothing has a distinct, separate essence. Everything is connected. I'd like you to imagine this idea in the following way. Everything that exists in the universe, everything that happens, all objects, all beings, all events, they're all connected to each other in this large web. And each event or thing is one node in the complex web that's connected to everything else. It's kind of hard to explain this idea because it's kind of foreign to our Western ears and our Western way of understanding how the universe works. Due to Western science and philosophy, we kind of have this view that each thing is separate in and of itself. This water bottle is a separate thing than this phone. And we don't need to know anything about what a phone is like in order to know what a water bottle is or what makes this a water bottle. This is kind of how we think of things in the West, right? We can understand a watch on its own terms. We don't need to know what couches are in order to know what watches are. We don't need to know what shirts are in order to know what water bottles are, right? Everything has its own distinct essence. Everything is separate from one another. This is not what the Buddhists think, okay? Eastern philosophy in general has a view of the world in which everything is actually connected and informs everything else. So, in some strange or weird way, the reason this phone is what it is because of the way that everything else is. This phone is connected to everything else in some way. What this phone means to us, how this phone impacts us, is conditioned by, well, what everything else means to us and how everything else impacts us. In layman's terms, they have this view that everything exists in relation to everything else. Things are not ultimately separate from one another. Everything is connected. That's what is meant by this idea, pratitya samutpada. Another central idea to Buddhism is the concept of anatman, which literally means no self. In Western society, we have this view that we have some sort of personality or soul or spirit that persists through time and is unchanging. That makes us who we are, right? We have this intuition that when you look at baby photos of yourself, you're like, yep, that's me. I'm the same person. The Buddhists don't really believe in this, okay? They don't think that humans actually have a permanent, unchanging self or essence. There isn't one thing that remains stable through time that makes you who you are, like your soul or your spirit or your mind or whatever. Rather, every human being is a collection of processes. Every human being is constantly in flux. There isn't one thing that we can point to say, yep, that's what makes Professor Gunnar the way Professor Gunnar is. Rather, Professor Gunnar, on the Buddhist view, is just a collection of processes, a collection of parts, a collection of things that are constantly changing and dynamic. And you already kind of accept this insofar as you accept modern biology and chemistry, right? There are a bunch of chemical, biological reactions going on in your body right now. You're digesting things. There are neurons firing, electrical impulses going around in here. There's stuff happening, right? It doesn't look like there's stuff happening. On the outside, it looks like I'm staying the same, but there's stuff happening in here. Also, it's said in biology, right, that every 7 years, all of the cells in our body have changed. We have different cells than we did 7 years ago. This also kind of lends credence to the view that there isn't one part of us that remains unchanged through time, but we are constantly in flux. We are constantly changing. And searching for a permanent or unchanging self is searching for something that doesn't exist. Okay. Let's now jump into how Buddhists see the nature of reality, what it means to live a human existence, and what that implies about how we ought to live, or at least what path is available to us. All of this is contained in the Buddha's four noble truths that he expressed to his followers during his lifetime. The first noble truth is known as the truth of suffering. In this truth, the Buddha basically says, suffering exists in the world. What it means to live a human existence is to live an existence that is full of suffering. Suffering that you feel and experience, and suffering that you actually contribute to as a result of your speech and your actions. Basically, the Four Noble Truths can be summarized as, here is the way the universe works, here's why, there's something that we can do about that, here's how. The first noble truth is, here's how human existence works. We live a suffering life. And what they mean by suffering is something like dis-ease, unsatisfactoriness, unfulfillment. We have longings for things. We have desires for things. We're not happy all the time. We experience pain. We experience suffering. Our expectations get dashed. We experience disappointment. All this is what is meant by we live a life full of suffering. We are not ultimately always content with ourselves and the world around us. We are unhappy. Life sucks, and we know it. And we contribute to it. That's just the way life works. But there is a cause to this suffering. This is where we get into the second noble truth. The cause of this suffering, dukkha, is fueled by ignorance and desire, according to the Buddha, or what we might call possessiveness or selfish wanting, which is known as tanha. You can see an example of this in the picture on the left, right? We have desires for lots of things. We have desires for food, for sex, for drugs, for psychological security, for love, for water, shelter, clothing, for world peace. All right, we have all these desires. And what's worse than that is, well, we don't really know that much about how the world works. We're ignorant about what we want. We're ignorant about how to get what we want. We're ignorant about the effects of our desires on us. We're ignorant about the way the world works. The suffering in the world, according to Buddhism, is caused by our ignorance and by our desire, our wanting for things. Think about it like this. Let's say I really want coffee, right, out of my awesome Lord of the Rings coffee mug. Well, I look in there. Let's say I don't see any coffee. I don't get any coffee. It sucks. I really want coffee. My expectations are dashed. I'm disappointed. I wanted to be able to put that awesome hot bean water into me, right? Or let's say you want sex, or you want drugs, or you want pleasure, and you don't actually get to have that stuff. It doesn't feel good, right? You want that stuff, but you're not able to get it. Your suffering is caused, at least in part, by the fact that you have these desires in the first place. So, if suffering is a result of not getting what you want, how can you eliminate suffering? What if we eliminated our desires? What if we worked on eliminating our need for coffee, our desire for being loved by others, our desire for a good reputation? What if we learned to accept the world more as it is, and we didn't try to constantly impose our will on the world and always get what we want? That leads us into the third and fourth noble truths. The Buddha says suffering, dukkha, can be eliminated through the elimination of desire, or tanha. This is the third noble truth, otherwise known as the truth of the end of suffering. That is, getting rid of desire, craving, and attachment to the world will allow us to escape our suffering. I'm not going to be disappointed and upset if I can't have coffee if I eliminate my desire for coffee, right? I'm not going to feel suffering if somebody doesn't say kind words to me if I eliminate my need and desire that kind words be spoken to me. right? If I get upset because I'm horny and I want to have sex and I'm not allowed to do that or I can't get that, I could eliminate that suffering entirely if I just taught myself not to want or need sex, right? If I condition myself to live that way. This is exactly what the third noble truth is trying to say. Suffering can be eliminated if we dissolve our own desires, if we get rid of our own desires for things. Because the reason that we're suffering in the first place is because we desire things and then we do things and those things have consequences and we're disappointed and our expectations are dashed. So, if we get rid of our desires, our cravings for things, if we get rid of our attachments to our material possessions, our relationships, making the world a certain place, we will be able to rid ourselves of all of this suffering. Thus, the path out of suffering, the fourth noble truth, involves transcending our own desires, which can be done through the Eightfold Path. There are 8 things, the Buddhists say, that we should focus on if we want to eliminate our own desires and therefore escape the suffering of human life and escape this reincarnation cycle of samsara that we are all trapped within. So let's now talk about that. What is this Eightfold Path exactly? What 8 things should we be focusing on and cultivating to dissolve our desires and eliminate our suffering? According to Buddhism, we should embody, cultivate, and follow through on having right view, thought, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. So, if we want to eliminate our desires and escape the suffering of human life, the first thing that we need to do is we need to cultivate the proper outlook on life, the proper view of the way the universe works. We need to understand the cycle that we're caught in. We need to understand how that affects us. We need to understand what drives it. And we need to understand how to get out of it. All of that is involved in having the proper or appropriate view of life. That is where we start. Once we have the appropriate view, we can start working on our thoughts a little bit. We shouldn't have hateful or judgy or mean thoughts. We should be thinking good things. We should be thinking positive things. We should become cognizant of our own deficiencies and shortcomings if we can, but we should not think poorly of ourselves or others, which might cause us to spiral. Also, we should work on saying the proper things. All right, we shouldn't engage in gossip, we shouldn't tell lies, we shouldn't engage in slander. We should use our speech appropriately to engage in communication, to build others up, to build ourselves up, and to put ourselves on this path that involves betterment, self improvement, and being kind and compassionate. This leads right into the fourth aspect of the Eightfold Path, proper action. We should spread love. We should be kind. We should do moral things. No cheating, no stealing, no murdering, no harming others. We should try to be compassionate in what we do, exhibiting generosity and love and patience. Consequently, we should try to work a job that is not immoral, that does not produce suffering. Okay? So, no owning sweatshops, okay? No being a slave master, no working perhaps on a factory farm if you think that increases suffering. We should try to work a job, engage in a career that is not harming others directly or indirectly. To try to continue to dissolve our desires, there are some other things that we can focus on as well, such as the sixth aspect of this, which is effort. We really need to commit ourselves to the path, the Buddhists are going to say. Okay, we can't half-ass this. If we're just kind of going through the motions, saying our prayers, doing what's right, but our heart isn't in it, if we're not motivated, if our mind isn't in the proper place, we're not going to be doing anything good for ourselves or others. Okay? It's going to be minimal. It's not going to help us along the path. We really got to try hard here, people. Okay? We got to really put some energy and some effort into it. We need to also be mindful of our deficiencies, how we can improve, where we are along in our spiritual journey. Remember, we're not all going to be in the same place. We're not going to have the same strengths. We're not going to have the same weaknesses. So we should be cognizant. We should be mindful of where we're at and how we can improve, how we can continue to walk down the path. That is why the cultivation of concentration is also very important. We can't allow ourselves to get distracted by all this stuff that doesn't matter. Okay? It doesn't matter if you're famous, if you have a lot of money, if everybody in the world loves or hates you, if that girl or boy that you've been pining after thinks highly of you. Okay, these things are distractions. Drugs, video games, TikTok, these things can be distractions as well. If we really want to improve our condition, if we want to escape suffering, we got to concentrate on it. Okay? We can't allow ourselves to be divided and distracted in all these different ways. And so, practically, what this looks like, and this is similar to a lot of other different religions, is we shouldn't engage in killing, stealing, lying, adultery, or getting intoxicated. You can understand the first three, right? People generally agree we shouldn't kill, steal, or lie. But maybe the last two you have a little bit of issue with. Maybe you're thinking, hey, what's wrong with having sex with people? What's wrong with smoking a bowl or doing Molly in the club? Well, there are a few problems with this, according to the Buddhist point of view. First of all, adultery, what's involved in that? Cheating, right? I think a lot of people would say cheating is bad. We shouldn't engage in cheating. Dante, in his Alighieri, in his series, Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, confines betrayers, cheaters, to the deepest circle of hell. There's something deep, intuitive that we understand about cheating, that it is wrong, that betraying is wrong. I think you can empathize with that. Well, how about intoxication? Why is intoxication bad? Why shouldn't we get drunk every weekend? Why shouldn't we do cocaine in our bedrooms and, pop LSD and shrooms whenever we feel like it? Well, part of it is that these things are distractions. They're distracting us from actually improving our condition, and in some fundamental way, they are constitutive of fleeing from our problems, right? When you get drunk or you get high, what are you fundamentally doing? Well, you're kind of trying to run away from your condition, right? You're trying to run away from your problems. You're not facing them. You're not building yourself up. You're not cultivating perseverance and resilience, right? You're turning a blind eye to them. You're running away from that stuff. Why? Well, because life is hard. Life sucks. It ain't easy. It's hard to deal with that stuff. But if we don't cultivate strength, if we don't face up, own up to our own deficiencies and our own problems that we're causing in our lives and in the lives of others, how are we going to improve? How are we going to do better? So, you should think of the prohibition on intoxication here as at least saying something like, look, it's not the worst thing that you can do in the world, but it is going to prevent you from learning and growing and becoming a better person. And insofar as it's doing that, you might think, is it really valuable? Do you really want it in your life? Well, think about that a little bit. Instead of doing all that stuff, we should remain sober and concentrate on the path that we are on, devote ourselves to it. We should treat all beings, animals and humans, with kindness and compassion and love and empathy. We should practice forgiveness. We should avoid quarrels with others and gossip. We shouldn't let our anger or resentment or fear get the best of us. Fundamentally, Buddhism is going to say we need to develop self-control. And this is an idea that you're seeing in a lot of philosophies of life coming out nowadays. Whether it's the philosophy of cognitive scientist Andrew Huberman or psychologist Jordan Peterson or Steven Pinker or any of these other figures, right? The Buddhists also are going to say self-control is really important. Because if you allow yourself to be a slave to your desires, a slave to your fears, your expectations, your worries, you're going to be stuck within your suffering. You're going to be stuck in your situation. Okay? You need to face your fears. You need to control your fear and not let it get the best of you. You need to resist temptation to stray from the path. You need to build yourself up in body and in mind so that when these different situations in life confront you, you know what it is that you ought to do and you naturally do it instead of falling into temptation, worry, fear, hate, and resentment. So, again, this is kind of an individualistic spiritual view, right? Whether or not you end up transcending, escaping this cycle, is up to you, the Buddhists are going to say. Yes, life is not fair. Yes, people do things that are cruel and not cool. But how you respond to those things, how you let those things affect you, and how you whether or not those things affect your future are things that you have control over, ultimately, the Buddhist is going to say. So, we need to cultivate strength, we need to be loving, we need to be able to control our desires and not give in to them all the time. This is very similar to a Western ethical theory, what you might call a philosophy of life that was developed by the ancient Greek thinker Aristotle, who was Plato's student and personal tutor to Alexander the Great. Aristotle famously said in his book, The Nicomachean Ethics, that if we want to live a happy, healthy, and flourishing life, what we need to do is we need to cultivate what he called the virtues, certain states of mind and habits, dispositions to think, speak, and act in certain ways. So we need to practice cultivating being generous, being honest, being witty, being just, being friendly. These are all things that we need to work on so that when situations present themselves, we just are naturally a good, honest, just, happy, generous, courageous person. Something that we need to work on. We need to mold our character in order to be that way. Thus, according to Aristotle, these different virtues of generosity, courage, friendliness, and wit, they are mutually dependent and reinforcing. Insofar as you cultivate the virtue of courage, that's going to help you cultivate generosity. That's going to help you cultivate wit, and that's going to help you cultivate intelligence, which is going to help you to cultivate justice. And they're all mutually dependent and reinforcing. Well, the same thing is true of all of these elements in the Eightfold Path. Okay, as we get our proper view embodied and instantiated in us, that's going to help us with our thoughts. Our thoughts are going to become more proper, which is going to help us with our speech. Our speech is going to become more proper, which is when we say proper things, that's going to make us internalize the proper view more, which is going to help us do proper things. All of these things are mutually dependent and reinforcing. If you work on one, that's going to help you work on all the others too, including your livelihood, concentration, effort, so on and so forth. What we're trying to do by cultivating all these things is engage in a process of transformation where we fundamentally, radically transform our outlook on life, our attitude towards it, and therefore how we think, speak, and act during our lives so that we are better people, so that we can dissolve our desires, so that life works out better for us. And so to escape suffering, Buddhism is going to say we need to commit ourselves to Buddhism and everything that I just said. We need to direct our thoughts and emotions to what is called the middle way, which I'll explain here in a little bit. Speak appropriately, kindly, lovingly, no gossip, no slander, no lying. Act in a moral way. Be generous. Help old women across the street. Donate to charity. Uh, Help pick up stuff off the ground that people dropped. Help people with their homework, so on and so forth. Enter a career that is moral, so we're not harming others, we're not harming animals or the world. Be committed and mindful to our own development along the path, which involves a lot of self-reflection, right? We actually have to think about what we're doing. We have to think about whether or not we could be doing it better, where our deficiencies lie, where our strengths lie, what we need to work on. We need to continually cultivate mental awareness of our environment, of our own internal mental landscape, of our actions, and motivation, right? We can't just be going through the motions here, okay? If we actually want to escape suffering, we have to engage in life in a sincere and authentic way, okay? You're not going to be helping anybody or yourself by just going through the motions, saying the prayers, not really meaning it, not really thinking about this stuff. No, you actually really have to work on it. Okay, it's going to require a lot of energy and effort. And finally, we should work on cultivating mental calmness and collectedness. If we fly off the handle every single time something in life happens the way that we don't want it to, where is that going to get us? Right? We can't constantly be giving in to greed and lust and anger and just freaking out when life throws curveballs at us. Okay? We have to work on being calm in the face of life's many challenges, cool, collected, patient, and learn, in some sense, to go with the flow. So we're not anxiety-ridden messes who are going to be dragged back down into emotionality and worry and fear. All right? All of this stuff is what we need to work on if we're going to liberate ourselves from suffering, according to Buddhist philosophy. And so how we do this, big umbrella, big picture way, is by walking a middle way between extremes. And we also see a similar idea within Aristotle's ethical theory as well. The Buddha advocates for taking the middle way between the extremes of sensuous pleasure and complete and utter deprivation of all that exists. Morally, we shouldn't lead a life of hedonism. That is, we shouldn't just give into and chase after pleasure, sex, drugs, rock and roll, food, comforts, drugs, alcohol, whatever. We shouldn't live like that. We shouldn't be chasing pleasure all the time. We shouldn't reject pleasure when it comes our way. But we shouldn't also chase after depriving ourselves of everything. Being like an ascetic monk who just sits in a cave all the time, doesn't eat or drink anything, is meditating, doesn't get to hug anybody. We shouldn't do that either. Okay? Because the Buddha saw living in the palace, leading a hedonistic life was not fulfilling, didn't get us out of suffering. Similarly, leading a completely ascetic life with all the monks also did not lead him to liberation from suffering. Neither of these extremes are going to help us. We need to walk a middle path between them. A balanced life. A life that balances pleasure and deprivation. Okay? Intuitively, we kind of know how to do this, right? You know when you eat too much, what that feels like, and when you're engaged in that. You know when you're depriving yourself of too much. You'll feel it, right? We can also talk about the middle way in relation to epistemology and metaphysics. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. What we know, how we know things, what's our evidence for stuff, etc. In relation to these ideas, the Buddha would say we should walk a middle way or a middle path between ignorance of all that exists and conventional belief. we shouldn't just be dumb, stupid idiots. Okay? We should learn how the world works. We should learn how people work. We should learn how the universe works, how the cycle works, and how to get out of it. Okay? We shouldn't be ignorant of everything. So we should seek after knowledge. But we shouldn't just accept everything that society and our parents tell us. Okay? Our culture, our society gets things wrong. Okay? If you're political, arguably you would say half of the country gets everything wrong. Right? So you shouldn't just accept everything that the news, media, culture, and society tells you. This is what is known as conventional belief. You should question that. Okay? You should be a little bit skeptical. So we should seek after knowledge, but we shouldn't just trust everything that everybody tells us. Okay? We actually have to reflect and think about this stuff. Finally, we should walk a middle way between being and non-being, according to the Buddha. What does this mean? Well, let's use an example. This cup is an inanimate object. It has a certain being. What does that also mean? It also means that this cup is static, right? To be something means that you have certain properties, you are a certain way, right? This cup cannot change itself. This cup can't think. This cup is only going to change if I do something to it, right? Otherwise, it's going to stay the way that it is, right? It's going to be a static object, unchanging. We shouldn't be like that, okay? If we are like a static object, unchanging, we are not learning or growing, okay? We're not actually progressing along the path. We should live a dynamic life in which we are progressing, in which we are changing, in which we are learning, constantly improving ourselves, constantly progressing along the path to liberation. So we shouldn't be a static thing that doesn't change, and we shouldn't be nothing, right? Rather, we should walk in between these things. We should be something that is always becoming, in the words of the Buddha or in the words of Heidegger. We should be progressing. We should be learning. We should be growing. If we're not, arguably, we're not doing anything good for ourselves or others. This is what it means to walk the middle way in the moral, epistemological, and metaphysical dimensions, according to Stephen Lamachus in An Introduction to Buddhist Philosophy. Thus, we shouldn't chase after pleasure. We shouldn't chase after living in a cave somewhere, having no relationships, being cut off from everything, meditating all day. Neither of these ways of life are going to be rewarding or fulfilling for us, or is going to bring about human flourishing and allow us to escape suffering. We need to live a balanced life, a life that balances pleasure and deprivation, a life of wisdom that knows when it is appropriate to accept some of this and some of this, a life that in which we are constantly trying to better and improve ourselves. That's what we should be doing. Okay? In some sense, enlightenment is a binary. That is, it is an on and off thing, but it would be inappropriate to categorize it just as a binary, right? We know based on the legend of the Buddha that he attained enlightenment one day, so presumably one day he wasn't enlightened and then another day he was. But we really need to keep in mind that this is a process. Okay, it's something that we need to work at. It's something that's going to take time. For those who do reach enlightenment, an extremely small number of people, it's something that takes many lifetimes to do. So it's something that is going to require, according to the Buddhists, a lot of effort and energy and mindfulness on our part. We shouldn't get too down on ourselves about where we are at on the path. What is important is that we are moving in the right direction. So just keep that in mind as you go through this unit, as you read the passages for yourself. go moving in the right direction is what's important. Okay. I'd like now to just do one more thing before I end the lecture, and that is give you a brief glimpse at the primary Buddhist text that we're going to be looking at next week in this class. The Dhammapada, the sayings of the Buddha that was collected by his disciples and put in written form. The Dhammapada is an ancient Buddhist text that is meant to relay the Buddha's knowledge about all this stuff that we've been talking about to others so that they might also attain liberation from suffering like he did, along with satisfying our longing for justice. We all have this intuitive longing or desire that justice be established. One thing that the Dhammapada does as well as the Bible, with regards to Christianity, is it satisfies that longing for divine justice. We recognize that life isn't fair, that people get things all the time that they don't deserve. Unjust people prosper, just people get screwed, right? We see this. We know it's not fair. We don't think it's cool. And part of what we try to do in our criminal justice system is establish justice on earth so that people get what they deserve. Well, just as the Bible talks about justice being established at the end of time, when Jesus Christ comes back to judge the living and the dead, the bad people going to hell, getting what they deserve, and the good people going to heaven, getting what they deserve, the Dhammapada also discusses how justice will also be served, no matter what our life in this lifetime looks like. Eventually, the bad people who continue to do bad things are going to descend the cosmic hierarchy. They are going to, by their actions, be reborn at lower and lower levels. They might eventually reach one of the many Buddhist hells in which they suffer for the rest of their lives, in which they cannot escape, thereby getting what they deserve. Similarly, the good people who continue to do good things will keep being reborn in better and better lives, and eventually they may reach a point where they escape the cycle. So, all this is to say is that Buddhism, like other religions, attempt to show us that justice will be established one way or another. We're not going to see that too much in the passages that we're going to be looking at, but that's one of the themes that pops out of reading the entirety of this text. In general, the purpose of the Dhamma, the Buddha's teaching, is to look out for human welfare in the here and now, lead others to a favorable rebirth in the next life and succeeding lives, and ultimately the final attainment of liberation from suffering. What the Dhammapada is trying to get us to do is recognize how the universe works, that our lives are filled with suffering, what causes that suffering, and how to escape it. It is a practical text, but I want you to meditate on, as you're reading it, how the different passages apply to your life specifically. Because again, we're all at different points, the Buddhist is going to say, on our own spiritual journey. So how a particular passage strikes you, how you interpret it, might not be how somebody else interprets it and how it strikes them. So just think about that. There are also a few other things I want you to meditate on as we go through this unit on Buddhism. Firstly, what exactly is the relationship between your desires and the suffering you experience in your life? Do you buy the Buddhist idea that a lot of the suffering in your life is something that you actually have control over, that you can affect, that you can change? Think about that. Think about how your desires also impact the suffering you experience. Is it true that if you totally gave up your desire for sex, you would no longer experience any suffering with regards to that? Is it true that if you gave up your desire for your parents' approval, that you would no longer suffer if you didn't have it? Maybe. Think about that a little bit. Think about to the extent that you actually have control over your own suffering. How can you eliminate suffering from your own life? The Buddhist is going to say, well, you can do so by changing your outlook, changing your thoughts, changing your actions. Do you agree with that? To what extent do you agree with that? Who or what is responsible ultimately for the suffering that you experience? Can you say with a completely straight face that all of your problems are because of the world out there doing stuff to you? Well, think about that. Are there things that you could be doing right now to make your situation better? These are all things that I want you to meditate on as you read the Dhammapada and as we go forward in this unit. Okay, I think that about covers what I want to go through with regards to introducing Buddhism to you, its history, some of its basic teachings, and giving you a glimpse at the primary source that we're going to be reading. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great week. Okay, see you next week.